Hey guys, welcome to Wealth for 99 with Drew Rice. Today we are talking with a journalist, and I have the pleasure of meeting him and having to have spoke with him a couple times. And I think he has some really good insights. He has his own YouTube channel, his own website, and we're gonna basically get his insights on what it's like to be a journalist in 2021, and different things that affect him as a member of the working class. So, Joe, go ahead. Let us know, who you are and what, your general background is.
Hey, Drew, thank you for having me on the show. I enjoy the stuff you're doing, especially as somebody who wants to get a little more, finance and market minded. My name's Joe Payne, Payne. Political Payne's my website, my channel. You can find me on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those places. And I'm from Santa Maria, California. It's a very blue collar, working class, agricultural town. It's like halfway, we call it the Central Coast, halfway between, Los Angeles, Southern California, and the Bay Area on Highway 101. We're intersect with it, or it intersects with us, as it were. And I grew up here. I started on the school paper, and then I got an internship at a local weekly independent newspaper, and from there, worked there for years and years and years. And then a couple of years ago, left the paper. And last year during lockdown, I do lots of other things. I'm a musician. I'm a music teacher. I tune pianos. But last year during lockdown, I had accrued some equipment, and so I just started doing my own online stuff, started YouTube videos, started live streaming which more recently, and my own website, Political Payne, Payne, where I do my own original reporting. Did a lot on coronavirus. We had farm workers out here who were hit hard earliest. Also did live coverage of Black Lives Matter protests in Santa Maria. This area has been characterized as a conservative town for a long time. And there's been a shift. It's changed, and the Black Lives Matter rallies we had, demonstrations are really some of the largest we've seen in the city. And so I'm a progressive, I'm on the left. And so my, desire is to, from an independent perspective, as an independent journalist, just on my own with my own website, kind of provide that local coverage to my area, give people a different outlook than they're going to get from, even the paper I came from, which is independent, but of course the local corporate media, whether it's the newspaper or the TV news. And of course we have our own brand of conservative talk radio out here as well.
Right.
So just being a counter to that, or really just giving my perspective, platforming people. I've talked to left organizations that are doing mutual aid. When the Black Lives Matter event happened, we had the local NAACP and an immigrants' rights group was targeted with online attacks and even graffiti at one of their locations. So that's just stuff that would get ignored or passed over by traditional
not sensationalist
media.
enough. Yeah. For
Yeah,
MSM.
well, or just it doesn't fit easily into one of their categories, or maybe it won't stir up quite the social media storm that they're used to,
of course,
doing. But I also do commentary on national news and other stuff too as well.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. And I've really enjoyed listening to your live chats on that, because
thank you.
Yeah, you do. It's obvious that you are someone who's like actually interested in on the ground work, which I think is the most important part if you want to actually advocate for, changes, or even just understanding what's actually going on within, society, much better than someone who just, like Tim Pool, someone who just reads headlines.
Yeah.
While I, of course, disagree with him in general, I do think that those types of people can still add value. But I think that the true value does come with like actually working within your community and focusing on stories that affect those people.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because that was part of why I started my channel. Is you have very much like a mental block or fear of putting yourself out there. And when I would see people like a Tim Pool or other people who call themselves journalists, But really, from where I stand as a guy with, more than a decade of print journalism experience, being in my community, talking to people, finding out the issues. I have won awards. I got one over my shoulder here for my reporting on domestic violence in my community. It's just one of those things that, I looked on the internet. I was like, if people like this can just get on and say whatever they want, well, I should do that too. But I'm also going to come at it from a more informed position. As journalists, we are definitely consuming more news media than most, because we're trying to stay informed all the time to help keep our readers informed, or our viewers, or whatever. But then, yeah, I have the ability to go out into my community, and you see how social media affects these things. I did a video at a Trump event where counter demonstrators showed up, and there was like a scuffle. A Trump supporter started pushing and taking swings at somebody. And of
Oof.
course, that one gets a lot of engagement. And so I'm, also being a journalist and independent, I'm cognizant of the funnels that algorithms and other, pernicious things about social media will push you down, and incentivize you to do things, and report on things that are only divisive and less
Right.
informative, right? So that's the thing with the way I view my editorial responsibility is I have a balance in that stuff. That was just a moment where I did live coverage, and of course it's blown up because it's divisive, if you will.
Right.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
Awesome. Okay, so then that you've touched on a little bit, but that leads into first of all, I know that there are people. Obviously we all grow up, and at least for me, I know I definitely didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, even though I
yeah,
had a parent that actually was an engineer. So I still had a blueprint in front of me.
hmm,
But I think a lot of the time as adolescents, we don't really know what to do, and we're forced so quickly to go into a specific job.
yeah,
So
definitely.
that's why I think it's important to platform people with different, working class experiences in different
Hmm.
sectors. And so that leads me to what got you into journalism? Like, why is that the path that you chose, and positives, negatives?
Yeah, it's really kind of interesting. So in high school, I remember before I entered my high school in Santa Maria, I became aware that it had a film and video program that was actually really, really good. And I saw, like, my sister dated a guy who had a video he'd made that included special effects and all this other stuff. We're talking in the early, 2000s, the aughts, right? And so I was just from day one, if I knew when I got to that high school, I wanted to get into that program. And so I did. And funny enough, now that I think about it, the first time I ever engaged in journalism was in the broadcast class, at my film and video program. You had to do 1 year of intro, and then you could do advanced filmmaking and then broadcast class. So not only did I do reporting on my high school about, like, this new principal had come, and we all kind of saw her as an authoritarian, and she had put up all these extra surveillance cameras around the campus, put bars around the whole campus,
Dang.
yeah. And so I did reporting on that, me and a friend of mine. And I was also being into film and filmmaking. Of course, I was one of those Hunter S. Thompson fan bro
Oh
kids,
yeah.
and so after seeing Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and all of that, and getting to know who he was, I was just reading a lot of his work, fascinated by how, as a journalist, he would center himself in the story and tell it from his point of view, not being afraid to do that. That's what gonzo journalism originally meant. People tend to think it means you lie about things and you twist the truth, which he did in some cases, to spin a narrative, like in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Right.
But I mean, if you go read Hell's Angels, that's an example of him, centering himself in the story, because he really was hanging out with the Hell's Angels. He got himself like some crazy motorcycle and was riding around with them, and they kind of understood this is like a hippie journalist who wants to write a book about us. So they had him hang around until they ended up chain whipping him almost nearly to death.
Oof. Dang.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so it's a fascinating story. And I was just like reading him voraciously. And then the dude offed himself while I was in school. And so, out of a sense of, I got to do something, man,
Right.
I went to the school paper, and I met a really influential teacher there as well. I had these two really great mentors in my film and broadcasting class. I actually wanted to edit films before I got into journalism. And but then I got into journalism. One of my first pieces for the school paper was a gonzo piece where I went to this, there was like a hardcore show at a church, like that kind of screamcore music. And
Nice.
some kid had taken like a whole box of over-the-counter cough medicine with
Nice.
like codeine in it or something. Yeah, and so the cops and paramedics ended up coming. So I did a write-up about that, and it caused a whole controversy. And it was just, you know, something that church didn't want known,
I see.
and that not even none of the area media got involved in or looked at, or covered it all. But could have found out about it if they'd done some work. But I covered it at the school paper. My teacher went to bat for me like an editor would,
Nice.
when the big powerful interests come to squash a story or
Right.
have you retracted or whatever. And so it was just an experience for me that was like a formative one that showed me that, wow, so we have this institution here in town that is very actively wanting to control its image. And and just based on feelings I had about certain things in institutions, and maybe I was forming my politics at the time, I don't have a lot of trust for those types of institutions in general, right?
Same. Yeah.
And yeah, and so I saw them actively trying to control how they were perceived and how journalism could kind of peel back a bit of the facade that institutions put up. We also had a private school, a catty corner to us, Catholic private school, that, I mean, a few years later ended up having a whole scandal where a couple of female students were raped by
Oof.
a student, and the principals, who are also priests, covered it up, and they ended up, I think, being charged because they're mandatory reporters. And so, and just all these things that can happen, that so journalism can uncover things and show you what's going on in your community, things you might not be aware about. But also I do believe in somewhat in the idealism of we are setting the historical record in real time. When historians go to study a time and a place, one of the first things they do is look to local media and see what was being said in the paper about such and such event. Letters to the editor, how did it affect people, how do they feel about it,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely, because people don't realize that they assume that. I mean, while it is true that like the old saying of like the winners write the history books. That
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
said, historians that are, yes, obviously there is bias in everything, in media, in
Yeah.
books, in whatever. But
Yeah.
when people are doing, like, historians and anthropologists are doing the work that, like, their due diligence, yeah,
Yeah.
most of their, like, their first what is the term, their their initial evidence, right,
Mhm.
is their primary evidence. That's what it is, primary source evidence.
Yes.
They're
Yeah.
looking at those direct, quote unquote, like grassroots type efforts to understand how people in those specific scenarios felt at the time, what their motivations, perspectives were. Because the reality is that while we tend to view history in a macro way, those little micro, it matters that we understand why people act in a way at a specific time in history, and we contextualize that correctly if we want to be able to fully understand what's going on. And
Yeah.
local journalists allow that to happen.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and it's interesting how you can go back to a newspaper from 100 years ago, and you can read the bias. You can see the. I remember I saw a cover of the, I live in Santa Maria, the Santa Maria Times, at our local historical society. They had a cover of that paper from years and years ago. Possibly before my father was born, even. And it had a part of just the name of the paper, and the top letterhead of the paper said the missile capital of the world. And we have Vandenberg Air Force
Oh,
Base
okay, that's right. I
near
was about to say, I
Lompoc.
was like,
Yeah, not far from here. And they were just trying, or it was like the rocket capital or something.
right.
They,
No, yeah.
yeah,
No,
because it,
Vandenberg's. So, quick what an
sure,
insertion here. Yeah,
yeah,
I actually. So when I was in college, I worked full time at UPS in a warehouse. But then my last year in school, I knew I wanted to work with something space involved, and for that, you end up having to apply for like certain security things, and
oh yeah, yeah,
it costs money. For a company to pay for, or you have to individually
hmm,
pay for it. So that's why if you can get an internship with a company that will get it for you, it helps you
of
with
course,
negotiating. And so when I was my last year in school, I actually worked at the Missile Defense Center in
Well,
Huntsville, Alabama.
there you
And
go.
so
Oh
I
wow.
Vandenberg and Huntsville, those are like the two biggest ones. And so Huntsville is an example. Most people think of Alabama as middle of nowhere south. And for the most
Not
part,
Huntsville.
yeah, not Huntsville. Huntsville's
Yeah.
the only place I've seen a Sprouts and a Whole Foods in the rural South that's not in a
Yeah.
maximum metropolitan area like Atlanta.
It's funny. My mom and stepdad worked as contractors, IT contractors out on Vandenberg, and now they live in a suburb of Huntsville.
Yeah, Matt, it's Huntsville's great. I wanted to move to California because like if you're 24 years old at the time and you
Hmm.
can go live by near the beach in Southern California, what's the
Why
question?
not?
Like,
Yeah,
but
yeah. No debate.
Huntsville's amazing. Anyway, just wanted to mention that in there because yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Okay, go
just
ahead.
really quick, my point was Santa Maria has always, or for a long time, has been a bedroom community for Vandenberg in a lot of ways, and because it's so close, and so is Lompoc, of course. But the interesting thing is that this newspaper, the Santa Maria Times, the local paper, just openly celebrated in its letterhead, the military industrial complex, because it was, such a vital part of the local economy,
And this was
that they
also
they just openly celebrated
and
it,
also
right?
what year was this?
I mean, this is decades and decades. This is
Is
like
this
a
Cold War?
generation ago. It might have been post-war. It
Okay.
might be the 50s,
That's what the
or
reason
maybe
I'm
even
asking is
earlier than
because
that.
we got to keep in mind, McCarthyism, Cold War. There was a lot of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, but that's just so I did want to just mention that, in the context of every time and place has its bias, it has its leaning.
Of course,
For instance, we were going through this pandemic, right? And a generation ago or 100 years ago, we had a pandemic that was known as the Spanish flu.
right.
And it did not start in Spain. The only reason that it's called the Spanish flu is, and that people assumed it was from Spain, was because there was World War I at the time, and the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and everybody on every side of the war had a national security impetus to not publicize the fact that there was a pandemic virus ripping through their
Yep.
troops. Yeah, except there was one country that had freer media laws, or that had a less restrictive government over the media, and that was Spain. And so everybody went, "Well, Spain keeps talking about it; it must be
I
the Spanish flu, right?"
Yeah, and I thought that was hilarious whenever you have people say like China virus and stuff like that, and they're like,
Yeah,
and then they'll
that's
pretend to try and say that, oh well, I'm just describing where it came from. Wouldn't didn't we call? And I love it when they do that, where they're like,
yeah,
didn't we call Spanish flu because it came from? No, it came from Kansas, you idiot. Like
yeah,
it,
yeah,
it, it
yeah.
literally that's the most agreed upon historically place of origin is Kansas.
Yeah.
Like
Well,
so
oh man.
hey, this whole like China virus thing, it's literally a repeat of what happened then. Like,
Exactly, and it relies on jingoism and nationalism, and of
absolutely.
course racism and all those things. I mean, and
Yes.
and I mean, I don't know if we want to jump to talking about like, liberal bias or a left bias in media, because obviously
Yeah, we can skip to that
I'm
topic. Yeah.
well, I mean, so yeah, so we've talked about that. I think that informing people as a journalist is a vital service. you know Producing that first draft of history in real time is important, but also there's we do have in media, at least some of us journalists do have this, you could call it kind of a rose colored glasses or starry eyed view, that we are contributing to the society in a service, in the context of we're providing a service to our democracy because we are informing people. If people are more informed in this democracy, they're more likely to engage in it in more positive ways, that it will improve it, right? So that's why government transparency should be celebrated. It's why laws like Freedom of Information Act for FOIA requests are such a vital thing for us as journalists, and having government that feels that they have to respond to the media is important, and feeling like they have to engage with it and not just shut it out or demonize it, as we've seen recently.
Absolutely. And so yeah, on that note of whether or not, like, the classic thing of, I know Colbert used to meme on it talking about how, like, because of the whole generally speaking conservative side, especially the US, will say like, oh, media has, or mainstream media is like the new one obviously, has a
Yeah,
liberal bias. And then Colbert used to meme on that saying that, like, reality has a well-known liberal bias. Um and I think it's important to understand that, and I kind of want you to touch on this. I think it's important to understand that literally everyone, there is literally no media, and I mean media not just in actual like news. I mean, there is nothing that is created by a person that does not have bias. There is always
yeah,
bias. The question is,
yeah.
can we look at the contradictions within what is being said, and is it built on stable ground? And if it isn't, then that's when we need, and that's why it's important to take aspects from as many different sides as possible, to
Yeah.
to understand it better.
Well, there's a few things that activate, like when I have this conversation, because it's really interesting to me. I have been, as a journalist, I have been blamed for the issues that I'm reporting on, that I'm letting people know are happening. Like, I mean, in a sense, shooting the messenger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but like when we talk about, and you often do hear people on the right say, well, the media, and I imagine this guy like kind of wild-eyed pointing into the distance, the media,
Right.
right? And the thing that I there's a few different ways to think about it, and the first one is, well, what are we even talking about when we say the media? Because the media, like, are you just talking about the news media? Because we have entertainment media, right? We have all other, I mean, just there's the fashion media, there's
Yeah.
tech
Social
tech
media,
media, yeah.
magazines, TV
Well,
shows, like movies,
well,
literally
but then,
everything.
so right there, I was making really quick, and this is how I'd like to try to parse it out: is there's the genres of media, right? Like entertainment media, infotainment, and all the different sects of fashion media, tech media, whatever. But then on top of it, you have the actual physical media. Like, how are you consuming it? What are you
Very
talking about? Are you
true.
talking about print media? Are you talking about television news media? Or if we're going to just talk about news media, are you talking about the radio, audio, podcasts, internet? And then social media is quite different from just news media, because social media, news media has been forced to port into it in every possible way they can, because that's what everybody's using now. But
Right.
social media, in a way, is a whole other, like, entity, right?
Right.
And it's not just the internet, right? We have the internet, but then there's social media is a platforms, or a platform within that. But generally speaking, and when we back up a little bit, you can read Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. There's a lot of media critique where you look at the societal influences on media, right? So you recognize that newspaper owners have interests, and they very much, will, even though in some idyllic way they're not supposed to, they will exert their influence over a newsroom, right? I worked at a newspaper that was a free weekly, and so you had two parts of the paper that were really not supposed to influence one another, and that was advertising and editorial, right? And so, I did stories where that like I mentioned, an institution, or I wrote things about an institution that I was not aware the advertisers were working on a deal with them, and the fallout from my reporting was that the paper lost money, right? Because of that. So I was lucky to be in an independent newspaper
Very.
that they really wouldn't exert that influence. But here in Santa Barbara County, we have a very famous newspaper in Santa Barbara, the Santa Barbara News Press. It did tons of reporting on the Santa Barbara oil spill in the 60s or the 70s,
Right.
that really helped spur the modern environmentalist movement. And this paper years ago was bought up by a conservative billionaire, and she immediately began exerting her influence on the newspaper and chipping away, and removing positions and making life hard for people there, where over time it's become a bit of an embarrassment, where it was once this prestigious paper. And then they do things like after the AP said we're not going to use the term illegal to refer to people like illegals,
Right,
right?
right,
We're
right.
talking about undocumented people. They ran a really embarrassing headline over a photo of a bunch of Latina people in line at the DMV after a certain law was passed and that allowed undocumented people driver's licenses, and it just said illegals line up for driver's licenses. And so you see how the influence of ownership over a newspaper can affect it. Mentioning what I said about the Spanish flu, the government will have an influence over
Absolutely.
media. Law
Absolutely.
enforcement law enforcement will reach out to if a journalist calls law enforcement and so starts asking questions about a case, and and they will do this. A journalist will say, well, we have information to suggest such and such, do you have comment on that? If you go to a high enough agency, I'm talking like the FBI, the feds,
Right.
they will come to the paper with lots of lawyers and paperwork and say, you cannot run this, it will affect our investigation.
Oh, of
And
course. Yeah.
you know what I mean? So there's all these influences that affect newspapers, television media. Of course, television media, you also, I've neglected to mention the profit motive and how advertising sells so much media, whether it's television media, newspaper media. The paper I worked for didn't have subscribers. There was no delivery of this paper. It's in the community, you can pick it up for free, so it's entirely advertising based, right?
Right.
And so you might see in other parts of the country where a weekly paper like this, it might have pretty risque or out there stories because they have a bunch of strip clubs and bars and dispensaries advertising in them. But in this community, we have a strip club, and
Right.
there's a little teeny tiny ad in the back, but that also just would reflect the editorial direction of the paper, because it's in this community. We're not in Miami. We're not the Miami Weekly.
Right.
We're not, you know what I mean?
Right.
So there's all of that, all of these internesting factors that affect, how and why newspapers focus on what they focus on.
Right. And I think that's why it's important to point out, and you made very good points on that, where it's like the profit motive tied in because of advertising. Like, why am I
Yeah.
going, why on earth would I give money to a news organization to advertise something if they're going to say something negative about me? And that's why it's
Yeah.
really important in
Yeah.
understanding. Like, it's like I always say to people, like, if you're signing up for, a credit card or anything, like making any financial decision, it's like you need to ask two questions. One, who stands to gain from this? Two, how is it going to fuck me? Like, the reality is
Yeah.
that's how it works within a capitalist system, is someone is having to gain the upper hand on the other.
Hmm.
We need to understand, you as a consumer within that system need to understand, how do I maximize my outcome, and how do I better understand who is behind this, what's going on? Because as you mentioned, like, even out, because a lot of people, I feel like, don't realize this, they don't necessarily think of it, like, outside of news, where people are like, oh, there's a liberal bias in news. Just so everyone's clear, any movie where they feature the CIA, the US military, they have to literally work directly with those organizations to get permission. That's why you don't see American made movies that are critical, highly critical of
Yeah.
those organizations, with the closest being something where it's like, what's the Vietnam Apocalypse Now? Something like
Yeah.
that, where it's a
Hmm.
very, metaphorical discussion on it, but you don't see those direct. And I think one that was more egregious was, and this is in every country. This is not something that
Yeah.
is just U.S. specific,
Yes.
because the reality is that, of course, yes, the Soviets, everything was state-controlled media. The Soviets
Hmm.
definitely put out stuff that was overt propaganda
Oh
anti-U.S.
yeah. Yep.
However, when we go back and we think, the classic example is Dr. Zhivago, which is a movie from the 1960s about the
Hmm.
October Revolution in Russia. And it literally was like one of the main funders was the CIA. Like, it was
Yeah.
specifically anti-Soviet propaganda. Now,
Yeah.
then on top
Well,
of that, my favorite, because you mentioned being into like film stuff growing
yeah.
up, my favorite was that showed this was how the bad guys in American movies shift over time. Like, in the 1980s, they're mostly Russian. Before
Yep.
that, they're mostly German. In the
Yep.
1990s, 2000s, they're mostly vaguely Arab. Like, it's
Hmm.
it's manufactured consent. Like it's exactly
Yeah.
that. But
Well,
my point
I'll
is,
give you one. I'll
all
give you one a
media.
little more. Yeah, I'll give you one a little more recently. Saving Private Ryan. For in order for filmmakers like Steven Spielberg to get access to, literally millions of dollars worth of military hardware, jeeps, bombers, all the stuff that the military maintains. World War II, operational technology,
Right.
guns, helmets, uniforms. The State Department gets a say on the script. Like
It's
if people don't know that, there's a reason why Saving Private Ryan, is one of the most like heralded World War II movies for how it depicts, but it's an entirely manufactured story about that based on a premise that did not exist during World War II, which was this whole family's lost every man, every son has died except this one. We're gonna go rescue him, and sacrifice a whole unit just to go get this one kid. Just
right.
didn't happen in World War II,
Right.
and it was to promote this idealism around it. But the other thing that I find really interesting about this is so I understand the people who call just the media the liberal media, right? It might be that in newspapers around the country, generally people might have a more left or liberal lean. Doesn't mean that it's a true left bias, because even within the industry, you might be a left or liberal minded person, but you're trained in all these different ways within the industry, because them saying that has gotten so into the heads of media around the country, and because of certain things about the industry. There are a lot of ways where that liberal bias in some ways doesn't exist and works in the reverse. So one
Right.
example is the deference to law enforcement. Only recently are we seeing, there have always been news outlets that will challenge and investigate local law enforcement agencies. The paper I worked at was a good example of that. But also the deference to law enforcement in that, one of the great things about the paper I worked at, the Weekly, was that we were not like the Daily, which whatever mugshot that the PD would provide, usually of brown people,
Right.
would be run on the cover always. And again, these are allegations. They're arrested. They're not, convicted or tried at all. It's we've arrested people in connection with and suspicion of, right? And
Right.
here's an interesting way in which this played out. Here in Santa Maria, California, we had a big scandal with a previous police chief, Danny McConaughey, where he ran the department very poorly. It ended up with an officer who was having a relationship with a 17-year-old police explorer. Right, this
Oof.
is this weird relationship where underage kids, teenagers, hang out with police, right?
Right.
And this officer was preying on them through a bunch of just very poor decisions. They attempted to arrest him while he was on duty with his sidearm, and they sent like the guy's cousin and his man of honor from his wedding to arrest him. And the guy ends up pulling his gun, and he was shot and killed by his fellow officers. So there was this
Damn.
big scandal. That ain't even the thing I'm getting to, right?
Right.
So there was this big scandal. McConaughey retires, right? He's not expelled or anything. He leaves town on a golden parachute pension, right? And then we have brought in this other chief who came from LA County Sheriff's Department, which is not known for not having its own problems, but this chief came to clean up the department, move it into a big new state of the art, fully funded, massive, precinct, and really modernize the department. Geez, I'm trying to remember this chief's name, and I'm blanking on it a little bit, and I'll see if it comes back up as we're doing this, but as I'm talking about it. But so this is really interesting. There were a few years, I think it was like 2015, like right around the Trump time. In fact, there was a woman murdered here in town that Trump mentioned during his run, and she was murdered by
Gotcha.
yeah, an undocumented immigrant. But so what happened was MS-13 was sweeping through California, other parts of the country, and the homicide rate spiked in several major cities: Bakersfield, Salinas, Santa Maria. We are one of the larger cities between, like Ventura and County and Salinas. And we have street gangs, but our local street gangs don't really commit that many shootings or drive-bys, or at least didn't a lot. They're mostly stabbings and maybe smaller shootings. But for a year or so, there was just a rash of drive-bys, double homicide, triple shooting, all these different things. And it was basically MS-13 sweeping through California, trying to dominate the local street gangs and take over the drug trade. Now, in order to convict a bunch of these MS-13 guys who had committed crimes in Santa Maria, our local PD and this police chief, Ralph Martin, that was his name, Chief Ralph Martin, he was looking at all of these guys. They're working with the FBI, they're working with ICE. They called it Operation Matador, and they were going after these MS-13 guys. So what happened? They had these two witnesses, both undocumented, and they wanted to have them testify against these MS-13 members, but they, through monitoring MS-13, whether their phones or however they were monitoring them, they became aware that the MS-13 gang members knew that these guys had been arrested and that there was a possibility of them talking. Okay. So what does Chief Ralph Martin do? He releases a press release this is just before the 2016 election. He released a press release to all local media that these two men had been deported for committing some kind of theft or something. Now, my paper was basically the only local outlet that didn't run it, because we understood that, because we weren't in the business of running every mugshot the local police department sends us. That's what
Right.
made us independent media. One of the things, we're also a weekly. We don't have the room to run every mugshot. That was something the daily paper would do. The television media, all these local media outlets ran, of course, just uncritically, didn't ask any questions. But even our journalist who was on like the crime beat, kind of his ears perked up, and he said that, but we don't, like, that's not usually how California police agencies do. They don't deport people. They don't send people to ICE for these types of crimes, right? That's not standard operating procedure. So he was a little curious about that. And the same journalist, months and months later, is going through the court transcripts of this big Operation Matador, as they called it. And in one paragraph in this thick stack of court documents, did one officer allude to the fact that they had put out fake news. They had manufactured lies that they had deported these people to protect their identity, or
Right.
to protect the safety of their family, so these MS-13 guys wouldn't go for them. And all local media ran it entirely uncritically, because the law enforcement knew that they could, turn local media into a puppet for their purposes, and didn't think anything would come of it. Our reporter called the police chief, Ralph Martin, and he kind of just chuckled and went, huh, I didn't think anybody would find that. So, but yeah, I
Yeah.
did. And so it became national news after we broke it, that local police department sends out fake news, because that's when the whole idea of fake news
Of
was
course.
really becoming a thing. So that anecdote illustrates this one example of, you can call the media liberal media, but even then, like, journalists, whether they might have a liberal or whatever slant themselves, are trained, and just by nature of the industry, to police send you something that, well, you can take it to the bank because it's the police.
Right. And I
They're not gonna lie.
Right. And then to add one little put a pin in this,
Yeah,
yeah, I think it's also important to understand that when we talk about, like you're saying, you need to look at what structures are supporting this, who stands to benefit from the news that they put out,
yeah,
who is financially tied. Because, as an example, that's why when people say, like, oh, forget the ignoring that Fox is the biggest of the mainstream media, but
yeah,
they'll say, like,
yeah,
ABC, CNN, like, listen, yeah, maybe they're liberal biased. They are not left biased. Like, CNN is literally owned by Ted Turner. Like, the guy
yeah,
owns most of Montana.
yeah.
Like, ABC is owned by Disney. They're in the S&P
Hmm.
500. Like, this
Yep,
is not, they're not lefties. Like, yeah, they may
exactly.
say some things that are
Yeah,
socially progressive, but
yep.
that's not leftism. Like they're
Well,
not advocating for material change because it's not in their interest to do so. You
yeah,
know,
well, but then you're going to have to explain to most
of
of
course,
red America that there's a difference between left and liberal.
of
And
course,
according to them, I mean, even Joe Biden is the corporate centrist, pro bank, pro credit card guy.
right,
He's a communist, just like Bernie
right,
Sanders, right?
and
So
and
that's that type of
and for anyone
challenge.
that is the simplest way that I can say it, and I'll do a video on this as well, but the simplest way I can
Mhm.
say it is the difference between a leftist and a liberal. A liberal believes that the difference is whether or not they believe that private property should be a thing. I mean,
Yeah,
functionally, towards the end, that's what you're looking at. You're looking for
yeah,
one is pro-capitalist, one is pro-capitalist, but a soft form of capitalism, meaning that
hmm
they want there to be social progressiveness within capitalism, but they
hmm
don't have a problem with markets. Whereas a
hmm
leftist sees that the contradictions within capitalism will not allow it to continue to exist without degrading people's individual freedom, because you need both economic and political freedom in order to be free. With
yeah,
markets and people who have way more being able to control those markets, you do not have economic freedom. That's what leftists
exactly.
oppose.
Yeah, and under that umbrella of liberalism, like I mean, the small L liberalism, you have both political parties
Right.
operating throughout American history and having their own media outlets that are sympathetic to them. I mean, go back to the founding, you had newspapers that were, that the editors and the publishers were, Democratic Republicans, leaning with on the Jeffersonian side,
Right.
and you had John Adams
And Hamilton,
Federalist
yes.
type, yeah, and Hamilton Federalist newspapers that were leaning on that side, and they're the ones dropping stories about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
Right.
Stormy Daniels ain't got nothing on that. So
Right. And
this is as old as America.
oh,
That
absolutely.
that's what I try to get across to people is like trying to have a non-biased, any type of non-biased media. Well, it's just then you don't understand how media has operated, will operate, and and of course those are just political interests. Then we're not even
Right.
talking about the industry interests, the corporate interests, the money interests that go into that as well.
Exactly. No question.
Yeah,
Awesome. And so then the next topic I wanted to discuss is, because of how you had mentioned, there was during that fake news segment of where that was
yeah,
really peak in society, you had a lot of hostility towards journalism and the media. Because, and I
still
think,
do.
yeah, of course. And I think that
Yeah.
kind of touches on what we've been talking about. I think a lot of that stems from all of us. I think everyone who thinks critically, like regardless of what your political affiliation is, I think we
hmm
all kind of have a disdain for quote unquote corporate media.
Yeah,
And so yeah, I'd like to get your take on, like, trying to simplify what the real
yeah.
issue is there.
Of course. So, I tell people if you're going to go to corporate media and expect, good, informative news, it's kind of like going to McDonald's and expecting nutrition. You know what I mean? Good nutrition and a
Right.
balanced meal. That's not what it's there for. You just have the challenge of broadcasting. What does that mean, broad? It means it's to appeal to as many people as possible, right? And so it's going to completely wash over nuance. It's going to wash over, I mean, but I think part of why you have the explosion of podcasts and from everything from Joe Rogan to all the long form stuff we see on YouTube and elsewhere in podcast form is because you through broadcasting there is not a high paying audience for long form, just hours and hours of people talking. You know what I mean? That's why you need services like C-SPAN, that are just going to play the House of Representatives hearings, or the Marshall McLuhan. If you've ever heard of him, he was
Yes.
like a media expert and analyzer, right, of media, and he said the medium is the message. Right. So television is necessarily one way. It's going out to you. Part of what's interesting about the internet is I can do my YouTube live stream. You can do your show. And in real time, while I'm talking about it, my viewers can interact with me. It's back and forth. They can drop comments in the chat or questions, and I can respond to them. Television is not that way. To a certain degree, newspapers have been that way, right? Where a newspaper will release the record, the paper of record,
Hmm.
and then they have an opinion section, letters to the editor. People write in, and that before people were arguing in the comments, they were arguing on the opinion pages.
Right.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, and so you have really quick. What was your question
Oh
at the
yeah, you're
beginning
good.
of
No,
this?
so dealing with hostility towards journalism. I know that
Yeah.
you have
Okay. Okay.
I know you did a coverage of a specific Trump rally, and
Yeah.
so I kind of want to like hear about that, and then
Yes.
your more general like
Yeah. Okay.
the pitfalls of just
You said
blaming media.
corporate. You said corporate, and so I
Right,
went
right.
with that.
Of
So
course.
often when people want to blame journalists, they want to, because they're looking at corporate media. They're
Right.
just looking at it would be like, blaming the entire restaurant industry for obesity, right? When you have, I don't know,
Exactly.
you're going to blame the juice bars and the, and the organic vegan
Or
restaurants for the obesity
blaming
epidemic.
small business owners for Walmart coming in and taking jobs. Like
Exactly,
we all know,
exactly.
and that's my we all know corporate media sucks. Like we're all aware of
Yes,
that. The question
yeah,
the point though is to draw that distinction and understand the dangers of just being anti-journalist or anti-media because of
ex-
that.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So there's a few things to work here. There's that industry critique which I just made, right? But you have people who don't understand. That's why they have this feeling towards journalists. It we see that a lot, especially among I'm on the left, I'm progressive, so I see it a lot with libertarians and people on the right, where they don't have a structural, industry, or you could say whatever, capitalist critique
Right.
of an industry, and they don't recognize all the impulse, all the structural financial incentives and otherwise that push journalists in certain directions, and whether they don't like or not. Now, that being said, it's because also you just have people who have their politics, and any journalist who reports something against what their politics are, what they already want to hear, is now, you're political, you're an enemy, or you're bad, right? The fake news. And I mean, I saw it in examples, just reporting for my local paper. I would have, I would do reporting about, say, an issue that local indigenous farm workers faced. Like here in Santa Maria, we have a lot of people from Oaxaca, and they speak Mixtec, which is not Spanish; it's an indigenous language. So you have this whole, group of people in the town who are a minority, and they're not getting, it's not as easy for them to access education. It's not as easy for them to go through, to get, services from many different, not just the government, but nonprofits, or whatever else in town, things they might need, because they have a extra language barrier. So
Right.
we need interpreters in this town who can interpret from Mixteco to Spanish or to English all at the same time, right? But so we would do some story about, this is an issue that Mixteco farm workers are, or just residents are facing, and then I would get an angry email or call from a right winger saying, "Well, how come you're not reporting on the other side?" And I go, "Well, what's the other side of this story? This is a story about an issue this community faces." "Well, we don't want them here."
Right.
Okay, but there's not an other side to that story. This story is, here's an issue this part of the community faces, right?
Right. And
Everybody
that's
know. So conservatives want the media, they want everybody to be Fox News or their conservative radio show host, and to only exist on their leaning into their arguments and their bias,
right.
right? And
And I want to be clear.
yeah,
Everyone likes that. We all suffer from the desire for confirmation bias to,
absolutely, absolutely,
to
yeah,
affirm our opinions. We all like hearing that we're
yep,
right, like correct in that term.
yeah,
But I think that's why it's so important to like again always be critical of no matter what someone's telling you. If someone's telling you information, you should be the first questions you should be asking are why, like what do they have to gain from this, what is
hmm,
backing them, and like is there
yeah,
what is their motive? There's always a motive. What is their
absolutely.
motive? And then obviously you have to question the merits of that specific motive. Just because you disagree, just because they say something you don't like, that's okay. Saying I don't like what you said is not a substantive critique. We can talk about why it is you don't like having migrants in this area, which definitely has, in my opinion, a lot of economic factors that are
Yeah.
causing, scarcity, fears of economic scarcity in those
Yeah.
locals' minds. And I think, yes, we can have a very nuanced conversation about that as well. But
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You have, and especially marginalized like marginalized groups that do not have the representation to be able to get their story out without some type of conduit. Um,
Mhm.
it's really important to make sure that we give those people a voice, you know?
Yeah, well, but that's paper to paper. And so this is the other thing about, if you want to understand media bias and, this kind of the it's funny because I would have the anger at us for doing reporting like that from, that, like, I could think of one individual in particular who would throw this attack at us. You're just a liberal rag, and this and this and that. How come you don't mention such and such? Which I know he only knows because he read it in our paper, because nobody else covered that thing. You know what I mean? So
Right.
so there's a certain level of, they don't, like, there's just a lack of understanding of what's the word I'm looking for. There's a lot of process stuff about journalism that people don't understand. Like I said, the biases towards, certain institutions like law enforcement, but then just the difference between how the news, section works versus the opinion page versus the arts and entertainment,
Right.
section. And I mean, people just don't understand the process of journalism, or how newspapers are ordered, you know what I mean, or what it takes to
Right.
get in the paper. People would call us up all the time and be like, "Hey, can I get a story in there? Well, what is it? How much is it though?" I'm like, "No, no, 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 no. Like, you don't
Right.
pay for journalism. Like, that's unethical."
That's advertising, not
Well, why
journalism.
not? Yeah, yeah.
Right.
You could talk to advertising. Why can't you just come to a story? How much? Like, no, 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 no. Like, so it's from every level that people don't understand that. And I don't know if like. And here's the thing: ever since Trump happened, and there has long been a kind of a right-wing resentment towards media and journalists, and sometimes it gets voiced as the elites, or the liberal media, or the intellectuals, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you can go back and watch C-SPAN from the 80s with Ronald Reagan, and you can hear people calling into C-SPAN and happy how Ronald Reagan, well, he's telling the media what we want to tell them, that and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But when Trump came out and made the media a target, he put a target on their backs. He literally at rallies would point at the press pool and go, "Look at them, it's them, they're liars," and no, 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 you know. And this isn't even taking into account that most journalists, the vast majority of journalists, are not well paid. It's actually, journalism has for a long time has been blue collar work. For years, I never made more than 30,000 a year as a full time journalist, even a section editor, in California
Right.
in
Which
the
is
in the 2000 teens. Right? It's not. It's
right.
that's the reality for most journalists. I drive a used Toyota. I'm wearing Costco jeans. You
Right.
know what I mean? So it like, that's the reality for journalists. But we, just characterizing all of it, painting just this broad brush over everybody as they're all the New York Times, they're all CNN, they're all MSNBC. It's been massively corrosive,
Of
and
course.
journalists have faced personal attacks, physical attacks. I went out to a Trump rally, and it's my most watched YouTube video because I caught a Trump supporter pushing and taking swings at a counter protester, a counter demonstrator. And before that, I was talking with these Trump supporters, and some of them were totally friendly and asking my questions, but other ones of them, other Trump supporters were calling me fake news and, saying, "Do you support pedophiles?" Because, Joe Biden and all this
Right.
stuff, right?
Right.
So, going into the QAnon stuff. So it's made our jobs more dangerous. And another really concerning thing was, because of the resurgence of Black Lives Matter and media organizations actually showing more skepticism to law enforcement, when this subject we've talked about, the deference to them, they were facing physical attack. Journalists face physical attack across the United States by law enforcement,
Right.
right? I have a friend, a colleague, and we went to community college classes together, who was shot point blank with a crowd dispersal round in Oregon. There were people who had their eyes shot out, or their eyes are no longer, they're blind in those eyes because of being hit by pepper balls or
Rubber
tear
bullets.
gas
Right.
canisters. Yeah, and and Trump openly celebrated journalists getting hit by pepper balls or whatever it was, an MSNBC reporter.
Yes, yes, yes. And same with like
Yeah,
legal observers. I know a lot of people that,
that
like
too, that
it,
too. Yeah. Hmm.
that's why, again, the people doing that, it's great for people to, talk
Hmm.
about stuff on the internet. Obviously, it's a net
Yeah.
positive, but actually going and reporting on the stuff, like actually reporting, going and doing that groundwork that journalists do, and also reporting on that groundwork is really what matters. Like
Yeah,
that's
and really
all of it's
it's
good, but that
yeah.
is far more important for like building a better society.
Yeah, and it's a cornerstone of our democracy. It's right there in the First Amendment.
Right.
A lot of people like to talk about free speech, but right in there next to it is the freedom of the press, where our rights can't be infringed. Right? I mean, we go into war zones, we go in the
Mm,
middle of riots and unrest, to document what's happening. To let people know this is in fact what's going on in the country. We also, there's all different forms of journalists, but
right.
if and that's just the thing. I think for the most part a lot of Americans want to know if their government's engaged in like corruption, you know what I mean, or any kind of, they're so quick, those stories do sell too. And people want to hear about that. They want to know if their local police department had something like what I mentioned earlier. They're lying to the public or covering things up. But if you recognize law enforcement as a conservative institution, and
Which it
just
is. I mean,
yes, which it
and
is.
which I want to be very clear
uh,
is not saying anything about the individual officers. It is a substantive
no,
critique of that is what left and
ex-
right means
I
when you go back
yep,
and look, because it stems from the French Revolution, and
yep,
the members of parliament that would support the institutions at the time were on the right side of parliament. The ones that
yep,
wanted to reform it were on the left side. That's where those
yep.
terms come from.
Small c conservatism, small l liberalism,
Right.
and we are a liberal democracy. The founding fathers were radical liberals,
Exactly.
partially because one of the things that they said was you cannot infringe on the rights of the press. They
Right.
get to write what they want to write. And, that even then, I mean, John Adams did what the Sedition Act, which there were Trump people very clearly saying, "Hey, Trump, you should just enact this. Start using this to attack the outlets that you don't like." And that
Right.
is what fake news became after what it originally meant was fraudulent information, propagated online. It became to mean on the right, like that any reporting that I don't like, that
Of
that is
course.
critical of me.
Of course. And what people need to understand is like that conservatives are liberals. They just want to
Yeah,
uphold older versions of liberalism. Like
exactly.
it all stems from the belief in the existence and the right for private property, and the belief that a democracy in some form or another, representative in our case, those two things combined with market capitalism, that's what a liberal is. So that's
Exactly.
another thing, is again back to that whole like left versus liberal. We need to understand that when we're talking,
Hmm.
like, Dennis Prager is much of a piece of crap. He is like, Dennis Prager calls himself a classical liberal for a reason, and
Hmm.
and of the of Prager's used videos that of course are mostly, they're all crap, but I will say the one that I actually think is accurate for the most part is the one where he talks about leftist versus liberals. Like, he
Yeah.
actually does understand the distinction between them, which I think
Yep.
most people in America do not, because they're so
Yep.
caught up in the duopoly of like conservatives versus liberals. It's like, no.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings back the whole point of the hostility towards the media, towards the media elite, right? We need to
Hmm.
understand that, and we need to, it's important to like discuss with those people, to talk about, like, what is it that's actually the issue? Because yes, you do have like, you're not wrong. Like, you are wrong
Hmm.
as far as like saying that, journalism is bad, but the reason you're saying it, you're not on the wrong path. Like, you understand that, hey, these interests that manufacture consent through the
Hmm.
donors that be in the favor of the donors and lobbyists that they have at the corporate media level. Yes, what they are doing is directly screwing over the average person, right? It does
Yeah.
it does not benefit us. Now, the fact that
Yeah.
you're getting that messaging from a person that inherited more wealth than you or I will ever know, who is literally an elite, talking about Donald Trump in
Yeah.
this case, you kind of have to question and say, hey, maybe he's part of this. Like, nobody,
Yeah. No, but
it's
that's why you need a structural critique. So you can have
exactly
when I hear media elite, I know people are thinking about just who you don't like on cable news.
right. They're
But
talking about George Soros. They're just not being direct.
well, when
Like,
I think of media elite, I think of Rupert Murdoch. I think of Michael
I think of Tucker
Bloomberg. I
Carlson, yeah,
think of, well, no, I'm thinking about the owners
of the
like
owner,
Rupert Murdoch,
of course,
Michael Bloomberg, Ted Turner,
Bloomberg is,
even
yeah.
Jeff Bezos.
Oh
Like
yeah,
we're at the
Washington,
point
yep,
now where billionaires, the wealth class can just buy their own media, create their own media. You might have the Koch brothers who just disseminate, spread seed in a field and pasteurize all these other, smaller entities on their own to just create, right wing talking points into the discourse, right?
exactly,
Whether it's in think tanks or nonprofits or media, I mean, Dave Rubin is getting money from the, like
yeah,
people who across this atmosphere or this ecosystem of media, including the new online media, like they have the means to spread those ideas themselves.
yeah,
Nobody bankrolls the left, right?
exactly,
And not the liberals. I mean the left. I'm a
right.
left progressive journalist. No, like I don't, there's not piles of money sitting around for me
No,
like there are for, a Dave Rubin or, Crowder or,
oh, any, yeah,
Prager, Dennis, you mentioned Dennis Prager,
right.
but,
It's the most
you
egregious
have
and
to,
obvious.
yeah, yeah, of course. And he's a propagandist,
Right.
and so we need to be clear about these things because now it's all mixed together. If I were a lawmaker, I would try to make an education law that introduced critical thinking,
Absolutely. Yeah.
logic,
Oh yeah. I'm a heavy.
media literacy, like from kindergarten on, just like basic critical thinking in
Right.
every step of the curriculum. That would be my what a thing I would try to do. Of course, education has been attacked and defunded in all these
Of
different ways,
course.
but that I find would be important because people don't even know. Like I went to talk to a high school class years ago when I was editor of the paper. And I asked them, "Hey guys, where do you get your news from? What's the source for your news?" And they all went, "Facebook." I said, "Facebook is not a news source. It's just a platform. What are you reading? Like, where are you getting your news?" And none of them could say. And of course they're kids. You don't
Of
want to put
course.
kids
But
on the spot, but that's a whole thing where. And then we know the algorithms are siloing people and balkanizing people. Already before social media, we had corporate news, cable news balkanized along political lines because of the market pressure. Fox News came around, was overtly conservative, called everyone else liberal media. And in a certain degree to survive, because they netted the majority of the market, you
yeah.
saw CNN and
A-
MSNBC
And I want to
tack in the directions they went in order to address the market pressure. That's just a
and I want
market.
to insert one thing there that
Yeah.
that people that think like, oh, CNN is liberal and this and that, just so everyone's clear, Rupert Murdoch started Fox because he didn't get to buy CNN.
It,
Like,
I'm old enough to remember when CNN was boring.
yeah,
When it was just just I remember yeah, this is topical. Lou Dobbs was on CNN
right.
and he was just boring Lou Dobbs and he didn't
Well,
really have
and
anything
Tucker, when
opinion at all. Tucker was there
Bowtie
too, but
Tucker was on there, like,
Bowtie Tucker had an opinion. Lou Dobbs was just a reader of the
right.
news. He didn't offer commentary. But then Fox News comes along and then he hops over to Fox, and I kind of see in the media world going conservative, it's kind of like going country. You know what I mean? Like you have an automatic
Hmm.
audience
Yeah.
set up for you if you do it,
And it's
and
very niche down. You'll get more, like, it's easier to succeed within that market.
it's
And it's just,
profitable. It's
yeah. And
way more. There's way more money there. You
there's more
know.
money. It's a smaller subset, more targeted niche. Like, yeah, it makes
Yes.
sense. It's
Yeah.
the same as like people. I remember because of growing up in rural North Carolina and Georgia, as a kid. I know people would always like jokingly say like, "Oh, George Strait has more number ones than Eminem." It's like, yeah, that's on the country chart versus the Billboard chart.
Yeah.
That's like
Yeah.
comparing your high school track meet, like county track meet
Yeah.
versus the U.S.
Yep.
trials. It's not the
And
same comparison. Like,
they control though. They
but
control
then
who
add the
is it
money.
comes in.
Right. Then you,
I mean, what was that song, Old Town Road?
yes, yes, yes.
He went to the top of the country charts. They kicked him off of the country chart. They said he doesn't belong here. It was a rap song. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So conservative media will do that too. Nancy Grace went against the new God King Donald Trump,
Right.
so she got iced out of it, and then she tried to go to the more center liberal, cable outlets, and it's like you're the lady who told people there's that Santa's white, he's not black. So we're not
Right.
going to forget that. You
Right.
know what I mean? So to me, the interesting thing now that we've seen is Fox News has, I mean, Fox News was an outgrowth of conservative talk radio,
Right. Like
which is
Limbaugh
a direct result of
and Hannity.
the yeah, which is a direct result of the end of the fairness doctrine, where in broadcast you specifically had to bring on people with opposing viewpoints and give them equal time. Once that ended, then you had conservative talk radio.
I had not heard that
Fox,
before. That's actually really interesting.
yes, and so Fox News followed that in the 90s, and it just balkanized. I mean, you want to talk about the polarization. Social media has just taken all these incentives that already existed, cranked them up to 10, siloed people and pushed them in more extreme directions. You know what I mean? So
Yeah. No,
it,
absolutely.
it's complicated. It's a big, there's a lot to it. But at the heart of it is like, where's the money being made?
Yeah.
There's a reason why Noam Chomsky was always a boutique, published author who, a bunch of left Americans, have supported across all these years. But he never stopped being a college professor. You know what I mean? He always had to pay his bills that way.
Right.
But there's, Bill O'Reilly every couple of years can put out his new "The Death of Lincoln,"
Yeah.
or killing
Kennedy,
JFK,
yeah,
killing
exactly.
Liberty, or whatever new thing he's. And my favorite thing is he had the book called Culture Warrior, which
Right.
they just they're letting you know what they're up to. You know what I mean? That this is their project, right? And me as a left progressive journalist, I'm trying to inform people about things that maybe they're not aware of, because not only are you not gonna get it from conservative. I mean, of course you're not, but you're not even going to get it from the local, what a conservative would call the liberal media. No, this is just a corporate newspaper. They're trying to appeal to everybody. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
and it doesn't serve their monetary interest to let you know, hey, there's a bunch of local leftists who are organizing mutual aid, and they're like, fuck the church, pardon my language,
Of
on your
course. Yeah.
channel, because they're indigenous and they want to tear down statues of Juniper Serra, the mission, the guy who helped start the missions in the state. You're not going to get that even from the paper I came from, because even as an editor there, I would, if I tried to report on that, I would have gotten pressure from other editors, even from the publisher, probably, to be like, this is very like just hyper focused, specialized. Like, we're trying to appeal to this larger audience, and I'm not sure that is even like, you could say that's wrong and that's bad. That's a bias against leftism in America, but at the end of the day, that they're also just trying to make money and appeal to,
Right.
who they know is going to buy the advertising.
And that kind of comes down to the reality that within a market-based system that is, that commodifies media and basically
Yeah,
everything, that is what's going to happen. And yes, we can
yeah,
understand that no, it is not quote unquote wrong for them to do that
hmm,
within the capitalist system that we live in. However, we
yeah,
can understand that it is antithetical to what is good for the average person who wants to be better informed, you know.
yeah,
And
exactly.
so they're
And
not
the
bad
profit
people.
motive is
Right.
huge.
They're not bad
Yeah,
people. That inherent incentive is the problem. And that's why I
yeah,
think looking at models towards like similar to what the BBC does, where it's much more of a
Yeah.
public focused, not profit driven
Yeah,
media.
I tell people if you want like the cable news channel like format, but no, with a lot of the less of what I was just talking about, go watch PBS NewsHour.
Yeah.
Judy Woodruff is a pro. You know what I mean? Like when people were
Yes.
complaining, I can't believe CNN and MSNBC and everybody's talking to Stormy Daniels and Puerto Rico is the Hurricane Maria has just destroyed Puerto Rico. PBS NewsHour, the whole front half hour of the 40 minutes of the whole dang news hour was just Puerto Rico. So like there are places you can go for it. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Exactly.
And I think what we're seeing now on social media and on all these different platforms, YouTube and Twitch and otherwise, is now this new generation of actual leftist people trying to start their own media just because they recognize nobody's going to do it for them, nobody's going to bankroll them. They just they have to do it, and everybody's gaining their followings, and now they're going to war with each other, and we
Of
see all
course,
that.
but
It's
but
balkanizing itself.
seeing like especially Twitch, seeing like the like AOC with Ilhan Omar and Hassan Piker,
Yeah,
Twitch
playing.
streaming to like 500,000 people. That's like
Yeah,
beautiful to see. It's
yeah,
beautiful because of the fact that like regardless of whether a person disagrees with those people politically, if you do, well then you should probably be pushing for the same thing on your side and see
exactly.
who which while I think we can all say that generally speaking, yes, we average people always have some amount of disdain for politicians. I think we can understand that there is a substantive difference between politicians that are actually willing to interact with
Hmm.
real people,
Yeah.
and I think it shows.
Yep.
And
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, yeah, to me that these representatives are just meeting people where they're at, which
exactly,
is
which is
on
what
those channels, and that's the weird thing about social media is you have all these people freaking out about AOC talking about her personal experience with the Capitol attack, and going, she needs to get to work, she's a politician, I don't want to hear about her personal life. Well, then why are you watching her personal social media
right.
platform where she's talking to people who she has an audience for that? You know what I mean? And you can
Don't
criticize them for it, but she's literally, it's like,
yeah,
9 or 10 at night, she's on her personal thing and she's talking about how she felt about something.
exactly. Which is, hey,
Sorry,
don't be so triggered, dude. Like,
Exactly. Politicians do that all the time. You can hear just because they used to go to the local whatever meeting or the Kiwanis Club and talk about their personal feelings there instead of on these massive platforms.
right.
It's the same thing.
And which is it? Do you want because there was always that whole like what was it? The teleprompter gate, like the whole thing about Obama reads off a teleprompter.
Oh my God.
And
Yeah, exactly.
which do you
Yeah.
want? Do you want someone being emotional raw with you
Yeah.
on social media, or do you want them reading from a teleprompter? You got to pick one. You can't just say I don't like it because
Yeah.
I disagree with this person.
That's something that the online generation just demands is authenticity. You know what I
Exactly.
mean? And because so much of us interact and live online that, and we, there is a hyper cynicism that is, it just comes with being online discourse. And part of that is, I mean, that's why people responded so negatively to Pete Buttigieg, is because everything seemed rehearsed. You know what I
Oh
mean?
yeah,
And to a
yeah,
certain degree, you have to recognize the success that Trump had with the fact that he let it all hang out, and would,
right.
cuss and make, crass jokes and, be authentically, himself,
Yeah,
bad in my opinion,
milk
you know
toast. Oh, of course, terrible.
authentically himself, but people recognize that he was being who he is.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? And not the polished, thank you
milk
very
toast
much. You know what I mean?
technocratic
Yeah,
politicians are not going to like that's the issue. You have those people, that's the norm, that's what people are used to because they're used to there being
exactly.
much more of a barrier to entry because of much less of a, I wouldn't necessarily call it democratization of media, but what I mean
Yeah,
is that it used to be there were more barriers for you to be able to get on a platform like cable. Now with the internet you don't
absolutely.
have that.
Absolutely. And that is a good thing about the internet and social media. Um, we can have a whole conversation
Oh yeah.
about like the editorial responsibility of social media companies and, where are they responsible and all of that. We can get into that.
Yes,
Um,
I
you know,
will do a run to the bathroom real quick.
Me too.
Okay,
Yay.
perfect timing. And then we will get back in just a moment.
Let's do it. It's like we're live. You're like,
Yeah,
We'll
exactly.
be back after this.
I know we said at the beginning, and Joe will mention some more specifics at the end, but I'll have the links in the description box for Joe's channel and his media website. Definitely go check those out. Like I said, he's doing really good work on the ground, and then also he
Oh,
has his own.
Jesus.
He's a worker in his own right outside of that. So just giving a little bit, just reiterating to the description box will have your channel and website link. So be sure to check that out while we were waiting on you.
Whew.
Perfect.
Sorry about that.
Oh no,
I don't know how some of these podcasters
Oh
do
man, Joe Rogan, that man's gonna have some prostate issues. Like I don't know how you can hold it that long.
it. Oh no.
Yeah. So let's go to talking about. I know you wanted to talk about conglomeration of local media, kind of piggybacking. I know we're going to be kind of traversing the same stuff a little bit tangentially at least, but I know you had talked about conglomeration of local media being like a pretty big issue, and then we can use that. Let's discuss that real quick.
Yeah, so if people aren't aware, it used to be in the United States that communities big and small around the country had their own media companies, for the most part, that were corporations or companies, but had local ownership. Okay, and all the issues that we talked about earlier about the whims and the wants of wealthy media ownership class people owning the means of media, those are all there and present, of course. But what's happened over the years with corporatism and conglomeration is that you now have most daily newspapers throughout the United States are owned by a few companies. Here in Santa Maria and to the north we have San Luis Obispo. And I'm in North Santa Barbara County, and we have San Luis Obispo County above us. We have the Santa Maria Times, the Daily, and then the San Luis Obispo Tribune, and they're both owned by like competing conglomerates, Lee Papers and I think Pulitzer, or I could be mixing up. They change names all the time
Right.
too, these conglomerates. And so this has a huge effect. Not only does it kind of standardize what the news everybody's going to get, the national news, right? That of course also goes back to just the whole Noam Chomsky and manufacturing consent, when everybody's getting the same perspective, right, all the time.
Right.
But then as far as the local coverage goes, you have a lot of the challenges of corporatization, where they're going to try to spot redundancies and save money in every possible way they can, and
buyouts.
Buyouts, yeah, of course, buyouts. Oh yeah, and I mean,
like accumulation of capital is the way that capitalism works without going unchecked. Like without some type.
Yes.
That's why the Sherman Antitrust Act is important. That's why, like when he's talking about this, you need to keep in mind that what he's talking about is the erosion of small businesses. Like even if you're a person that are a small business owner, wants to be, that's what he's talking about, and he's talking about that through the lens of like, this is the natural path if you don't have regulations to prevent such an act, because it's profitable to do so.
Yeah. So like here's an example. We used to have here in Santa Maria, and then to the north, closer to Vandenberg Air Force Base, we have, to the south, Lompoc, right? I mentioned Lompoc earlier. And we had the Santa Maria Times and the Lompoc Record. Now I would have to go look at the history books or go into the microfiche to really figure out, when they were independent of each other and when they became part of the same, company. But, they used to be two of their own papers that had their own editorial staff, advertising staff. But now, because they've been bought up by a big conglomerate, over time, the Lompoc Record, because Lompoc is the smaller city, shrunk to the point that, even though it's released in Lompoc now, it's mostly all the same content from the Santa Maria Times. They have like one reporter in the whole city of Lompoc, which is a city of like 60,000 thereabouts people. But because Santa Maria, the valley, is more than 100,000 people, it gets precedent, it gets
Right.
precedence, right? So that's just on this one local micro level where the paper in this part of the it's like you have the paper in the bigger city, and it kind of has these little mini franchises out in the smaller cities in the area, and those papers just suffer. There's less reporters.
It's McDonald's,
um
like you said earlier.
exactly,
It's just
but
franchising, like you use that term, but it's literally that. Like it's taking, yeah,
yeah, but it's imagine like this town that it has more people in it gets the nice big McDonald's with the nice lobby and the play place and everything, but then the one in your town, just because it's smaller, is drive through only.
yeah,
That's what we're seeing with keeping you informed about your local city government, your just all the different aspects, the social issues going on in your community, and just the business community, the art community, all of that suffers, right? All of that, you just get less of it,
right. Which is
and
which is commodification of media. Like that's what's causing it.
exactly. And so when social media came into the factored into this, imagine now all of a sudden a paper printer came around and told every newspaper in the country, you only get to use our paper now. And so they immediately, everybody became beholden to this one company just because that's where the audience is now. Subscriptions for daily papers precipitously dropped and dropped and dropped because of social media. And then you just have just insistence, especially by Facebook. I have a lot of revulsion for Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg for what it did to my industry as Facebook took over the news industry, and it became the number one place where people read the news. And as Facebook started implementing these algorithms, I watched the whole local media industry suffer. I watched editorships disappear. My position is no longer at the newspaper I was at. We were a weekly. So I would say to people, we were a little like a drought tolerant plant because we only printed once a week. Like now the daily papers aren't even daily anymore. 1, 2, or more days a week, they're not printing the paper because they can't afford to print the actual paper.
Right.
Everything's going online. That's a direct result of Facebook. But it also affects the way that reporters report and the ability of the scope and the breadth of their reporting, because Facebook, frankly, juice the numbers on their engagement to gear it towards video. I mean, there have been court cases about this where they lied about how much better video posts would do than any other article, that would take you away from you'd still be in the Facebook app, but it would click over to an article outside of their platform where they're not selling the advertising anymore,
I
right?
see.
So they were juicing the numbers on their video, destroyed newsrooms. Newsrooms were across the country. Well, now all of a sudden, and it destroyed the way that journalists were trained. All of a sudden in J schools across the country now, these up and coming journalists are now taught, okay, yes, you might want to take this class on how to read a budget report or go to a public meeting or how to cover law enforcement or local government or water rights, property rights, and all of these things that we traditionally train you for. But listen, kid, if you want to be competitive in the market, you're going to need to know how to make a video, live stream, podcast, make a slideshow. You're going to have to know all of these other things and it's not just because social media and platforms like Facebook have become ubiquitous, because they have, but because of the corrupt, unethical practices of these companies, things
Absolutely.
like that, juicing their numbers just to keep it so that media companies would be making content that would keep people on the news
For
feed where they could
advertising.
sell you advertise.
For
Exactly.
sure.
So
So then let's
that's what really gets me into a lather, is thinking about how America has balkanized to such a degree where we've polarized, and people are now less informed about their own communities. And of course, now we're also seeing all the other things, the cascading effects of conspiracy theory, anti-science, distrust amongst community members, because they are now hyper focused on a national politics instead of what's going on locally.
Oh, absolutely. And then also that has to do with the alienation that people face due to the commodification of it. Like it's
Absolutely.
yeah, it's nothing
Absolutely.
nothing new. It's just a different outlet. It's a different way of alienating people. But
Yes.
by making them closer, it's kind of and actually let's move on to the next topic. Let's talk about that
Okay.
more specifically
You bet.
with social media industry shifts, the online, like the incentive structures, like you've already been kind of pointing out, and then
Yeah.
looking at specifically, how does that play into like Section 230? How do we navigate that going forward?
So, it's interesting because, like, we've talked about the whole idea of media bias and media having a liberal bias. It's interesting because I have encountered more, or at least a lot, of journalists in newsrooms who have almost like a libertarian, it's more libertarian than liberal outlook, because being a journalist, you tend to be wedded to the idea of free speech, right?
Of
Where
course.
I should be able to report whatever. Nobody should be able to tell me what I can or can't, do. And of course, but then you have these cascading subjects of editorial responsibility, truth telling. Yes, people are free to get on a microphone or on a keyboard and say whatever they want. But the issue with social media is now we have these algorithms where it's not, people are not just exploring content freely. They're being guided as
Yeah.
they do it in ways that you don't even understand
And
as
then
you're
you
doing.
add in people like, Dan Bongino, Shapiro, I know, like that
Yeah,
they're spending truckloads of cash on like they're buying
they're
they're
juicing their
buying
numbers.
exposure. That's
Absolutely.
why when you're
Yeah.
talking about
Yep.
it's not even really free speech. First of all, because it's not a public thing. It's not a government
Yeah.
issue. It's a private company. So
Yeah.
technically speaking, it's not free speech. But
Yeah.
it's not even free speech in as far as like I have less freedom than someone like that, but I have more freedom than a person that doesn't have an opportunity to be able to do this at home. Because even though
Yeah.
everyone is free to, it takes time and also some amount of like investment in like a mic, things like that. But it takes
Yeah.
time that I know when I worked at UPS, I sure as hell didn't have time to do this.
Hmm.
I didn't even have time to like learn how to do it in a way that's like effective. So we have to
Absolutely.
realize that there's the people who have more means are able to tilt the table in their favor because of the fact that it's commodified and there are those incentive structures. So
Yes, yes. But then not only that, though, on top of that, you have just the very real penchant among many people in the American populace and around the world to want to consume, conspiracy laden, untruthful things, confirmation bias, things that confirms what they already want to hear, reactionary content,
yes,
dishonest content, right?
right,
And the algorithm juices that as well. So, the example of, you can go watch a video about contrails, the dispensation of moisture from the back of jet airlines. And, for years, YouTube and others, if you watched a video about contrails, a factual thing, they would then be sending you to videos about chemtrails
oh,
and what
i've
are they spraying on
I've
us and
gone
all
down the
that.
dark path of YouTube. Like
Yeah,
I've seen the Anunnaki videos and all that.
of
Talking,
course.
yeah, like I've
Yes,
I've seen it,
yes.
and the irony is like the fact that I lean like I have similar political views,
Yeah,
and yet like hey I like so I think it's really interesting on Facebook for me
yeah,
because of coming from a rural area and then now I live
yeah,
in Los Angeles, and a lot of my like best friends are international. Like yeah,
yeah.
I have a very progressive worldview,
Mhm.
and
You
it's
probably have a
really
diverse timeline too.
exactly, and it's really
Yeah.
interesting to see because like my girlfriend is an example. She's lived in California her entire life. Her family were immigrants from Iran. Like
Mhm.
her worldview is very different. So when I go to Facebook, I have like about half the people on there are constantly resharing like Candace Owens or Prager
Mhm.
or John Stossel, and then
Mhm.
on like. But my girlfriend doesn't see that really, other
Of
than like
course,
the
yeah.
ads from like Turning Point and Prager. But for me, it's like it's amazing because of coming from that area, coming from this type of surrounding. It's pretty surprising that I ended up where I am politically,
Yeah.
because again, it's just that confirmation bias, and then also just the social pressures of like what other people think, and not be not just falling prey to that. But yeah, I see my point in saying that is I can't tell, like literally if I go on Facebook just anecdotally and I go and look and I'm scrolling down, as far as sponsored pages, it'll literally be like Prager, the Hoover Institute, the Hodge twins,
Hmm.
Turning Point, Shapiro, the
Yeah.
Daily Wire. Like
Yeah.
I see it, like until I subscribe to like Jacobin, never saw a sponsored thing from them. Like
Yeah.
it's
Because they don't have the money to
it,
reach that many people.
and that's people
But
don't realize these algorithms. I'm going to do a book. I'm going to do a review of a book by Tim Wu talking about that, and that's why like things
okay.
like net neutrality really really matter, because
Yes.
if you allow
Yeah.
companies to Facebook is, I mean, in my opinion, is that Facebook is a monopoly, and Facebook does need to
Yeah.
be at least regulated in a way that is better for the
Yeah.
average, member of the community. Now, I say that as someone who I bought a lot of stock in Facebook last year because it was a good investment. That doesn't now.
Yeah.
I still think Facebook is terrible for humanity. Like,
But you'll
but
profit off of it, Drew.
right, but the reality is that just like that goes back to Chomsky. Like Chomsky used to
Mhm.
always joke about that because people would, point out that, oh, you work at MIT, and they, fundamentally what they do is they outsource research for government facilities, and a lot of that is
Yeah.
for the military and imperialism. And it's like,
Man's got to
yeah,
eat.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why having a view, a material based view of the world is very important to understand that, like, literally every single person watching this, especially if you're a person in the West, um, your job in some way, one way or another, because of the way our economy is structured, like global economy, I
Mhm.
mean, you
Yeah.
are benefiting off of someone else's suffering, literally, no matter what you're doing, whether that's investing or working. Yes,
Of
you
course.
are being exploited as well by people above you, like we're talking about, whether it's, in a just coercive way, like on social media. It is
Hmm.
happening. Um, you're not morally wrong because of the fact that you, like, if you served in the military and now you view it as like, oh, I think that the war in Iraq was wrong, right?
Hmm.
I I think it's very important for us to remember that too often we try to blame the individual, and I think that's a very idealist way of viewing the world. We
Yeah.
try to blame the
Well.
individual instead of
Mhm.
saying, "Wait a minute, hey, disproportionately poor white people from rural areas are the ones that get dragged in the military. Isn't there kind of
Mhm.
maybe an economic reason for that?" And that's kind of, I don't know, one of the only like jobs that they can get that has pretty good pay and a guaranteed benefits and pension.
Mhm.
Like, we can't blame, we have to remember, and that's the same with the media thing of, yes, there are people in elite positions that are, taking advantage of you, but it's very
Yeah.
important to understand why that is happening and not blame individual or poor people for the problems that they have to accept.
Well, of course, but if we want to
Sorry
like
for that tangent.
expand that to social media and traditional media like newspapers, like and that type of exploitation, when you look at Section 230 gives social media something that a lot of bad faith media elite wish that they had, which is carte blanche to let whatever anything at all run on their platforms because they're not the publisher. They have created this legal loophole has been created for them, that anybody can publish anything on their platform and they're not responsible. So me as a journalist, when I was editor of a paper, I would get letters to the editor that were saying things like Obama planted a chip in my brain and all other kinds of wacky stuff
Right.
that that we now see has spread unabated across the internet. And not only would I not run it just from an ethical perspective of there's no way to possibly prove that, and it's obvious this person, when you read their whole thing, they wrote they were suffering from mental illness.
Right.
But on top of that, there's the market incentive of the owner of this newspaper does not want to get sued.
Of
Like
course.
somebody could write a letter to the editor and say, I hate the mayor. The mayor, does everything wrong and blah, 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 and vote the mayor out. And okay, we can run that. But you could say the mayor did this, and I hate the mayor, and they do everything wrong, and they kicked my dog in the teeth.
Right.
Like all of a sudden you've made a claim that I'm on the hook for as the publisher, as an editor, of deciding to publish that on my platform that
Absolutely.
I am responsible for. Social media gets away with it, and this is a bit of the slippery sneakiness of the industry and individuals, very powerful individuals like Zuckerberg, who argue we're not the newspaper, we're just
We're not
we're a
editorializing. Is
yeah,
the
we're not the media. We're just a platform or whatever. Basically they have a giant, um, opinion section that they have a giant newspaper that everybody's publishing onto for them. Kind of reminds me of like Uber takes something that already exists,
exactly.
which is transportation, outsources everything on to the people, and takes most of the money. Right?
But
It's
even worse,
exploitative.
because every one of us that posts on Facebook, Twitter, any of these, we are effectively unpaid. Like we are doing
Absolutely,
this for
we're the product.
free. Yeah.
We're the
We're
product.
doing this for
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
that's the bigger, more nefarious thing is like you're saying, they're effectively they're one, degrading the product, but they're effectively outsourcing media, which only hurts
But
the
not
wages
only
within media as well.
yes, but they're also completely getting away scot-free with having editorial
Right.
responsibility, where it's irresponsible to run a letter to the editor where you say there's a cabal of satanic
Of course.
pedophiles who are wearing babies' faces.
Yes, of
Yeah,
course.
exactly. It's irresponsible because it's not true, and because if enough people believe that, they might do something really irresponsible and violent, like I don't know, storm a government building
Right.
during a very important
Hypothetically.
during a very important function of the government,
Right.
right? So based on lies, entire like
Absolutely. Yeah.
fabrications, right? So because they are trying to outsource that ability to do that to soulless machines and algorithms, and because they, in every step that they want to automate away human beings from, to it doesn't cost them as much money.
Right.
When
It's all an attack on labor. Like
exactly.
that's what it is. And that's why tech
Yep.
that's why like I'm I'm an engineer, and so obviously going to school, I have generally a positive view of like, what the good things technology can do for us. But at the same time, that's why you have to be very skeptical of these, like especially Silicon Valley companies. And that's why it's important to, in the same way that it's important to validate, like, a survivor like AOC's story. It's important to validate that. It's also important, and this is of course different, but in the same way, we should be human and validate what people have to say when they do complain, talking about like Silicon Valley has too much power.
It
But
does.
even if
Yeah.
they're wrong in their arguing that, oh, it's because Facebook is liberal, right? Because of fact checks. That's not really, I don't care about having that discussion with people because that doesn't matter. What matters is, yes,
Really
they
quick.
do
It's
have too much power.
it's a disingenuous conversation that's coming from the right.
Of
Like
course.
they will point to a study that Facebook is biased against conservatives, and literally the group of study is 22 accounts on a 300 million plus account, platform.
Right.
And among those groups are like Alex Jones and the Nazi Party and stuff like that, right? So
Right.
it's totally disingenuous. And this is what you're going to get from the so-called populist right, is you're going to get an argument that totally ignores the wealth class, the market incentives,
Right.
and all of those things. And that's why, me as a progressive left journalist, I'm stuck with engaging on these platforms to try to inform people and spread my message and share my commentary and analysis.
Right.
But at the same time, and like you mentioned before, I don't have access to the piles and mountains of cash that exist to plug my rhetoric and my information into people's feeds
Right.
like the right does, right? But
Absolutely.
I look at it and I see an industry problem. I see a conglomeration problem, and just the fact that Instagram is now, or Facebook is now facing an antitrust suit because of Instagram,
And they
because
should be.
the owner of Instagram literally approached other people in Silicon Valley and was basically like, Mark Zuckerberg's giving me an offer I can't refuse. Like Zuck is going to go into destroy mode is like the quote he used, where like he'll go after me, kind of like what we know, Bill Gates did in the
Yeah, I was
90s
gonna say
with
Microsoft.
with
Yeah,
Microsoft.
and
To have the Clintons, to have the Clinton administration bring an antitrust suit, you got to really be way out
oh
into
yeah,
that field to do that,
and
or
just
to get that.
I am gonna do two videos on that. One talking about the Curse of Bigness by Tim Wu, which is talking
Yeah.
about the new age of antitrust, and it's a good comparison of the antitrust gilded age in the early 1900s and big tech now, and talking
Ooh, I
about
got to read that. I got to
it's
read that.
really good, and it's only like 150 pages. Like it's
Oh, hey,
such
hey.
a, and if you have like a lot of it's refresher for if you're very
Mhm.
into U.S. labor history, but at the same time, it's really good because he talks about how ridiculous it is, the shift in the way that antitrust cases were viewed. Like
I see.
initially, it had to do with anti-monopoly. They didn't want so much consolidation, and so if you had above a set percentage of market share within a sector, it automatically was a case that was brought before Congress to
Fascinating.
deal with. But then in the 1960s, there was a switch whenever we started embracing a little bit more of like the Chicago economic school of thought within our public policy. They kind of shifted the goalpost on how, like, when antitrust mattered to whether or not it hurts the consumer through directly increasing the cost of the product, which is the reason that they keep having such an issue with filing antitrust now, because it doesn't increase the cost, right? You're getting this, this stuff for free. So it's not
Yeah.
directly, they can't
Yeah.
show that it's directly hurting the consumer. And that's the way they're weaseling out of it. The same as
Yep.
Microsoft, because Microsoft, the reason AT&T, the only two since the 1960s that have been brought before for antitrust and actually been like convicted for it, or whatever the term for that would be,
Yes.
found guilty of it, have been AT&T, and they got broken up in the mid 1970s, and then Microsoft. But Microsoft got caught, and then whenever Bush got inaugurated in 2000, largely because of the fact that the dot-com bubble had just happened, there was this massive crash in the tech industry. My
Mm.
guess, this is my assumption, they kind of just let it off the hook, because the economy was kind of in shambles at the moment anyway, and I think
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they knew. But the point is, yeah, it matters, and it is a monopoly. And the bigger, more nefarious one, for in my opinion, with Facebook is WhatsApp, because Instagram is bad already, but Facebook bought out WhatsApp and Oculus as well. And
Jeez.
what's so important about WhatsApp is that Facebook, which isn't necessarily as broadly accepted or not even allowed in several countries, like China as an example, in North Korea, WhatsApp is the most common messaging app, I believe, in
Aha.
the Asian continent, which of course has the majority of, or very pretty much the same amount of people as the rest of the world. Like,
Yes. Billions.
yeah,
Yes.
WhatsApp is huge. Like my friends from like India, that's what they use, all the time. Like their family uses it.
Well,
So
there you go.
when you realize they're collecting data, even if you're not on Facebook, they're collecting it on WhatsApp. They're like
Mhm.
on Instagram. This is a big deal. Like these.
Well, yeah, and this is why I think when you hear, and yeah, AOC, when she says something like, "I really worry about tech because this technology moves so fast," and we have senators going, "So the internet is a series of tubes," and like all
Right.
they
Those hearings are always funny.
we have dinosaurs who understand so little about it, and then even even those representatives we have in government who do their homework and learn about it, it's so rapidly changing and shifting.
Oh
I
yeah.
just hope they can organize people around. I mean, net neutrality gets a lot of support from people across the political spectrum. And if you just make privacy, because that's constitutional protection as well, the right to privacy. If you can get that, made into a cornerstone of like a digital bill of rights, or I don't know what you would call it.
Right. But something along, yeah.
We need widespread or wide affecting legislation or whatever else, antitrust. We need to bolster up antitrust law. We need to there's all this work that
Oh
has to be
yeah.
done. And these companies only get bigger and more money and more powerful. And what we're seeing, right and left, or Republican and Democratic strategists and thinkers and appointees and cabinet secretaries, even, who have consulted for these companies, have done legal work for these companies, or have just been paid straight up
Yeah.
by these companies to do political operations.
Absolutely.
So
And
it's
bigger
it's
yet.
huge.
And
It's
bigger
huge.
yet, I want one note on net neutrality, just as a basic description, so that people understand what we're
Yeah,
talking about. Net neutrality, most basic thing is net neutrality argues that like the internet lines need to be neutral, i.e., not controlled by a single or a few corporations, because that is going to fundamentally restrict who is allowed to do what on those platforms. And that
yeah,
way they're able to essentially, prevent you from speaking. And it would be no different than the way that media is censored in, like, say, like an authoritarian regime like China. The difference is it would be by corporations instead of
exactly,
by government.
exactly.
But it's
Hmm.
effectively the same thing for the user. And then the other thing was you mentioned uh, was, oh, when it comes to, yeah, AOC and
Privacy.
talking about the concern with tech. Yeah, it's a really big, it's a beast, and it's definitely something we have to concern ourselves with in the future. And so I kind of wanted to ask, like, as far as like, what is your, so I can't actually tell, what's your view on Section 230? Do you think it needs to be reformed, abolished? What's your thought?
As somebody, when you're a journalist, you kind of prize in the First Amendment, so you don't want to see restrictions on speech and the press. But what you have with Section 230 is basically social media getting it both ways,
Of
where
course, yeah.
they are not beholden to truth telling like a journalistic outlet is. I mean, Lou Dobbs just got You want to talk about cancel culture? It ain't a
Right.
culture. This was a legal matter. Fox News canceled Lou Dobbs because he would not stop attacking Smartmatic and Dominion and claiming the election was stolen. And now those companies are coming after Fox News for the tune of billions of dollars.
Right.
So that is a market legal ramification
Right.
of that irresponsibility.
Oh yeah.
So, but guess what? Where is a lot of that information propagated? Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp,
Absolutely.
Parler, all these other companies, that have only deplatformed Trump because just the whole treason thing,
Well,
is
and
a minor matter, I
and
guess.
I'm
But
and I'm biased definitely because of like my, like I
yeah,
mentioned, my girlfriend's family. But regardless, like, I don't know. Maybe whenever he was threatening to bomb what was it, cultural sites in a country that we aren't
yeah,
in war with,
yeah, or
may
threatening to
I
nuke
all I'm
North
saying is
Korea,
I,
or
I would have gotten
and
deplatformed a
and
long time ago,
a
like
long
any
time
normal
ago. Yeah,
person would have. Now, that being said, I
exactly,
want to be very
exactly.
clear that my view of it, as someone who's not, as intimately interested with, Section 230 and with the journalist
Mhm.
aspect of it, like my general view is, yeah, that's terrible. That sucks that he got deplatformed. Now, because of the precedent that it sets, I
It's
agree that
hold on, let me
yeah,
get
yeah,
this thing straight. It's only because Twitter is finally facing some ramifications, like the fact
economic
that they
ramifications.
Exactly, and that's where these things come from. And this is why Fox News is paying a price, and Sidney Powell personally, and all these other people for the Dominion and Smartmatic stuff, because you can just get on social media and make stuff up and say whatever you want because you're not the social media company allows it because they're not responsible for it because they have a loophole in Section 230, but a broadcast company like Fox News does not have that same buffer, that legal buffer.
Right.
So, it would be nice if we had journalists that always just fostered and told the truth. I mean, in my opinion, a lot of right wing media has fostered lies, but in the way that they tell them, they've been a little more crafty, like Rush Limbaugh saying Vince Foster was murdered by the. I'm just asking questions,
Yeah.
right? That
Right.
like there's a way that you can get away with it, and that is in a way. what social media has done, but they have let the cat out of the bag. Like, we literally are seeing a resurgence of, diseases we thought we had destroyed: polio,
Measles, yeah.
mumps and measles, because of anti-vax propagation of anti-vax stuff. We have people, suicide bombing themselves by cell phone towers because they believe 5G
Right.
is, affecting their biological well-being, or as part of some other nefarious plot. You
Right.
have a massive insurrection, or an insurrectionist attack on the Capitol during the transfer of power because of disinformation that was passed,
Absolutely.
and planning and organization
Absolutely.
that was brought forth on social media. So, these companies, and this isn't just this is a matter of free speech or this and that.
No.
These companies need to be accountable for the threat to public safety that
Absolutely.
their information, or that what
Absolutely.
they allow to spread on their platforms. Like, I'm sorry, but it used to be like the newspaper that I was editor of. Like, I would not print anything that was trying to say certain things about certain groups of people, right?
Right.
Because of how irresponsible that is. It's not just because of the legal and money ramifications of that, but because the ethics of it. But when you have outsourced that to machines,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Oh
Then,
yeah.
like, people, and that's kind of, you see that in represented with, like, groups like the Boogaloo Boys,
Oh
where
yeah.
they just, well, if we put on Hawaiian shirts and act like we might believe this or that, then we get a free pass, and we don't look quite like a crazy hardcore Oath Keepers right-wing white
Right.
identity militia.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's gaming. People are
Hmm.
gaming these
And
things.
we have to,
And
and I want to reiterate that everything we are talking about, yes, it is, yes, it does suck. That now, while I agree that from just strictly from a like a business standpoint, yes, Twitter should, within the system, the way the incentives work, should not allow Trump to do that because, yes, it's hurting their profits. Any person that's a heavy proponent, like even if you're a free market libertarian, you would agree that that's the way that a business owner should act in that instance. That being said, I do think that it's very important to remember that, yeah, it is a problem that a social media company is such a big factor in online discourse that one is able to basically censure a person. Now, is Donald Trump censured? No, he's not.
well,
That he's able to get
really
out
quick,
media as much as he wants.
yeah,
But my
but
point
this is,
is that
yeah,
that means they can do that to you because there's not that oversight.
of
And
course, of
that's the
course.
issue, and that has to do with the fact that it's a commodified it's commodified freedom, it's commodified speech. You know.
Yes, but it also has to do with the issues that these companies have gotten so large
Right.
that they're ubiquitous.
So
You
do
know what I
you
mean? That
so
you
it,
can't, you can't. There's not another Twitter. They always try
right.
to have one.
Agreed.
You know what I
It's a
mean? And
monopoly. It's the
yeah,
same. So what
exactly.
I want to say though is, then your opinion, because I so in your opinion, what is the long term path forward? Like, do you? I know I hear people say, like, break it up, nationalize, maybe
Mhm.
both. What do you think? Just off the top,
I honestly, I don't even, I'm not even sure I like have an answer, because it like I engage on these platforms, that they are beneficial. I stay informed through them. I connect with people like you through them.
right.
And so I'm not sure how I feel. I'm not sure I would want it nationalized and then beholden to the government's going to
And I
decide who
understand
gets to
that.
be on it. I'm not sure like what breaking up Twitter would even look like. You know what I mean?
Agreed. I think
So,
Facebook is the very easy breakup case because you
oh
break it
yeah,
up
because
into
they
the
own,
mergers.
yeah, they own so many other
Same
things.
with Google.
Eh,
Those are easy to break up. But
yeah,
Twitter,
yeah,
yes, is a little bit different.
yeah.
Um,
But already in some ways we've seen some like market response to just like the crisis in journalism. So you have all these platforms, which are huge themselves, of course, but that offer direct access and direct support, more direct support to journalists and journalism, like Medium, like
oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Substack, Substack, where people can just go out on their own and you pay a subscription. Patreon has been beneficial to a lot of people, content creators. But that's not quite the same. That's like me posting long form writing. It's not quite the same as a social media platform.
It's
So I'm
something you
not
have to seek out as an individual, like, which is the
exactly. And
barrier.
exactly. And so I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm not sure how you fix a Twitter or a Facebook.
Right. I think at
Um,
minimum we have to at least put like I think at minimum we would have to put some type. I think the argument for maybe not full national. I think I believe that we should fully nationalize and then break up. But I
yeah.
think if I understand why people wouldn't want that, but I think the reality is that at minimum you need to get rid of the advertiser influence in the algorithm in Facebook, and the only way to do that is going to be some type of government intervention because you're
Yeah.
effectively taking away a revenue stream. So you would
I mean,
have
hey,
to make it
if
nonprofit somehow, or
yeah,
you're going to cut into their profits. They're not going to be okay with that unless the government is expropriating some amount.
if they entirely nationalize, if we were to like somehow,
It's a dangerous line because then you have state
Bernie
media.
Sanders is president, and then we have just like the house is full of little mini Bernie Sanderses, right? If we like in an ideal world, we could nationalize these social media platforms, and all the control could be within your hands as a user. Like you could tune the algorithm to be like, I literally want to see every post from everybody that I know, every picture of their kids. I don't want to see it 4 days later after it doesn't matter anymore.
Right.
They've announced something. I want to see, not what's going to keep me on the platform, but what I choose to see. If you could have all these switches and dials where you could turn this up and turn this down and tool it to exactly how you wanted. I want to focus on news. I want to focus on sports. I want to focus on friends and family, whatever. If you could tailor it so you could have different lanes, of your one profile that you could go down, where you're in a family and friends mood, you want to look at pictures of cats and babies, your nieces and nephews or whatever, like that. I think that would be great, but that would also have to come with some type of a digital like bill of rights where you
Right.
are granted access to this platform and you're only going to be removed from it under these specific circumstances. And even then, that's going to be hard to police from the things that we know are causing harm on there, because that's the thing about the United States is the freedom of the press is protected. It used to be before social media. It's not like neo-Nazis and white supremacists didn't exist before that. They just had their own newspapers
Right.
you subscribe to, and then they mailed to your house.
Right.
You know what I mean? So
Oh yeah.
you're not going to eradicate that problem, and if you're going to apply the First Amendment to an online platform, then that's a whole other ball of wax, because you're not
Which is
even
why I argue that's the reason for nationalization. I mean, that's the initial reason. Is because then you can, without within the laws as they currently exist, then you can argue freedom of speech
it
on that
would there
platform.
would have to
But
be
there's a lot of
like
mess there.
there would have to be laws written just for this,
Right.
right? If that was to be done, there would be a massive just you think of how much the Patriot Act changed the
Oh yeah.
configuration of our legal structures and our government. It would have to be something on that level where not only are we nationalizing an industry or a section of an industry, which Americans usually don't want to do.
Right.
Like, it usually takes intervention from industry and wealth, to have something like that. I'm thinking of nationalizing the railroads, right?
Right.
Like that doesn't usually happen through, a groundswell of grassroots support. You know what I
Right.
mean? And to try and get the right and the left to agree on what the social media rules are going to be. We have the right wing right now is openly saying we're being discriminated against because these neo-Nazi pages are being taken down. So they're
Right.
Openly broadcasting that the neo-Nazis are part of our coalition and we're being discriminated against.
Right.
So it's like, what do
Which
we
is
do?
true. But at the
You
same
know?
at the same time, the other thing I want to point out to people is that like why is it that you're like who's behind that? Again, I always ask who is benefiting from this, who's behind it. We need to really understand that these aren't even companies that are succeeding because they're profitable initially. They're succeeding because there are venture capitalists who already have a ton of money that are bankrolling them to get them
Mhm.
to a monopolistic standpoint so they're able to make money. So we need to
Exactly.
understand that not only that, the people, so when people talk about the elites, let's be specific. We are talking about venture capital and the role venture capital plays in destroying small businesses, small media outlets, and manufacturing consent in order to
Yeah,
monopolize. Like that's and using users as using us as the product. Like it is it's not an accident, and that's why
yeah.
that's why there has to at least be limits within a market system because otherwise the people with the most money are able to move the market the most, and they're able to control
Exactly.
it.
And that's what makes it so complicated. That's why journalism, the question of journalism has always been complicated because of all those factors you mentioned.
Yeah.
But now it's just that's cranked up to 11 or 12 because of the how complex the internet is, how complex all these dueling social media companies are, and why people go to them and for what, and what people want to hear when they go there.
And as
You know
soon
what I
as you write
mean?
a law, there's going to be someone that develops something that sidesteps it just barely to then
Exactly,
take
exactly.
advantage. Like that's the gig economy,
Yeah,
like you said.
it's yes, it's massively complicated, and wealth is constantly working to do what's best for them, even if that I mean, I think Charles Koch recently was like in his book or somewhere went, oh gee, I sure did goof when I like funded all this stuff to divide the country. Boy, that sure did backfire. Like it was a big whoops a daisy
Right.
that he created this polarization, and all the resentments, and how he took a direct part in balkanizing the
Oh yeah.
American people against one another through these media, the new and the old media structures that existed. So it's massively complicated.
Of
I don't
course.
know the answer. I'm just a dude with 300 couple and more
I get
subs.
it. I get
You
it.
know what I
No,
mean? So
but
what can we do? I'm glad we're talking about it, but at the end of the day, like I'm constantly learning about this stuff too. That's the challenge of politics and being a responsible consumer of media is, it's all pulling your attention all the time. What do you want to focus on? And what outlets are giving you a good faith representation? Which ones are throwing up smoke? Like that's
oh
part of
yeah.
the challenge too.
And one last thing on this subject, I think it's really
Yeah.
important to realize that when you were talking about anti-vax and other conspiracy types online, a lot of those tend to come back to like Bill Gates or of late, or George
Yeah,
Soros or these other boogeymen, and I think it's
criticizing the right people for the wrong reasons.
exactly. I
You know
think
what
that
I
it's
mean?
very now. I do want to be very clear to anyone that's listening that if you only criticize if you only complain about George Soros, you need to look up that and understand that you are propagating an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, yes, people like George Soros, and what I mean by that is people with a level of wealth where they are able to, have socioeconomic and political control of the way things are, whether it's in media or in politics through lobbying. Yes, that matters, but you need to recognize that like George Soros has 1/10. His foundation is only worth like 19 billion. Jeff Bezos has 182 billion. So if we really think that the
Hmm.
issue is the amount of monetary control, what monetary control gives you as far as power within politics, we need to understand that, hey, maybe let's address that problem. These individuals like Bill Gates are not evil, right? And
Yeah.
this is my view. I do think that yes, it is an inherent net negative for society what they do, but they are not evil. The issue is the accumulation of that level of wealth is anti-democratic and will always hurt the average working class person, you know.
Absolutely.
And so, like you
Absolutely. I
said,
totally agree with
attack
all of
them
that.
for the right reasons.
Exactly. And Drew, I really thank you for having me on your show, but I got to run
Oh, of
this
course,
very
it's been
second.
oh
Um,
great. Yeah. So then,
yeah, we've been talking for a long time, so I really appreciate you. People
absolutely.
want to find me. It's Political Payne, Payne, on YouTube, Twitch, politicalpayne.com, and Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. All these companies we're
Right.
talking all this
Exactly.
smack about, but I
Exactly.
really appreciate you having me on, buddy.
Oh, definitely.
Uh,
Yeah. And definitely everyone go check his channel out. He does live streams on Friday and then puts
Cool.
clips up throughout the week. He's got a very engaged audience. So he'll answer, if you have questions, if you have stuff you want to comment, go talk to him. Very approachable guy. He's doing really good work. And
Hey,
yeah, he'll
thank you,
definitely be
Drew.
back on here. So,
Yeah, and I'll be having you on the channel sometime soon too to talk about building your own personal wealth for the
yes.
left, or as it
Yes.
were, whatever,
Yeah.
wealth for
For the
the
99%.
99%.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love it.
Hell yeah,
Cool. So
brother.
thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a nice day.
You bet.
Bye.